Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to keep yourself lovely and warm because it's getting cold out there, so make sure you get yourself those lovely cosy drinks, hot chocolates or whatever it is that you enjoy drinking, and whatever it is, let me know about it because I'm fascinated, and it's incredible the range of things that people are drinking, and you're letting me know the most extraordinary drinks that I've never actually heard of in my life, so thank you for that. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my grandfather had moved in with us, as my fastidiously protective mother claimed, with the threat of coronavirus sweeping the nation. Many elderly people were succumbing to the virus. She felt a great deal more secure knowing that Gramps was tucked away safely under our roof, out of harm's way. "I don't trust those nursing homes," she exclaimed. "Never have, never will. I'm sorry, but we really must insist that Gramps moves in with us." At first my Gramps was hesitantly reluctant to move in with us, claiming he didn't want to be a burden, and that sooner or later we would get so sick of him we would be begging him to leave. "Nonsense," my mother had exclaimed. "We could never get sick of you, Gramps." Regretfully, when Gramps moved into the bedroom suite on the lower wing of our double-storey house, we really knew little about him, as he had been living in a retirement home in Nebraska. We currently reside in Oklahoma, which is situated on the south central and southern plains of the states, bordering Texas, where we live in the pretty suburb of Nicholas Hills. It was only on very sporadic occasions or isolated celebratory events, like Thanksgiving and Christmas, that we ever saw our grandfather. We considered him to be a congenial man, but in truth we barely knew him at all. It was as if he was swept in and out of our lives like a feather blowing in the wind. If I'm being blatantly honest and very candid, I know it sounds inconsiderate, cold-blooded and callous, but I never warmed to the idea of the elderly man moving into our home, as I thought it would cramp my style. I'm about 22, and I doubted that, taking into consideration the huge generation gap between us, that we would have anything in common. I was to find out I couldn't be more wrong. My grandfather may have been wearing an older biological suit than mine, but other than that, he was not much different to myself. He was worldly wise, astute, perceptive, and very discerning, much more so than me. By all accounts, it would appear that throughout his tempestuous life he had gone through experiences that could teach me a thing or two about life. I have come to appreciate that older people can definitely help you avoid making the mistakes they did when they were your age. So it goes without saying that before long I began to enjoy having my Gramps around, as he became my very best friend. One day when it was raining cats and dogs outside, I was sitting with my Gramps on the opposite side of the kitchen table, tapping into my cell phone to connect with social media, while my grandfather was reading a Stephen King novel. I glanced out of the window to see the rain bucketing down, gushing down the drain pipes, while the baby cypress and black walnut trees in our front yard glittered with the silvery raindrops. The air was filled with the refreshing scent of petrichor. "Do you like scary novels?" I asked my Gramps, eyeing his Stephen King book beadily, that was so large it looked to be the size of a brick. "I mean, Stephen King, he writes some really grisly stuff, doesn't he? I do remember watching his gripping movie, Pet Sematary, wasn't it? Oh, it gave me the chills. I think a dog came to life with something." My grandfather stroked his moustache reflectively, putting down his book on the table. "You know what, son? You're absolutely right. I don't know why. Maybe the scare gives me some kind of a thrill, like you get when you go skydiving on a plane. Of course, it's intrinsically different when you experience a horror for yourself. Quite different then. So what was the scariest thing that ever happened to you, Gramps, in your long life? Have you ever been seriously scared?" "Oh, I've been scared a few times," said my grandfather. "But you haven't got a story as gripping to tell me as your Stephen King novel," I challenged cheekily. "Well, I might not have a Stephen King story to tell you, but I do have a story that you would consider quite exceptional. It happened to me a long time ago, when I was a young boy living in Tennessee in 1954, when I was 12 years old. Do you want to hear it?" "Go on," I said, putting down my cell phone. "I'm all ears." And this was the story he told me. Believe me, nothing prepared me for this. I grew up in a small wooden cabin in the Tennessee mountains. It was a very tough life. Life was hard in those days. Money was in short supply for us. However, for most under Eisenhower, the American economy was booming very nicely, thank you very much. But for those of us living in Tennessee, you could see we were left behind, almost forgotten, caught up in the debris of our impoverished lives, a fly in a spider's web. My mother had 3 children, but my 2 sisters were between the ages of 3 and 4, while I was 12, so obviously I was a lot older at the time. We had a good life, despite our lack of financial advantages, as when you grow up in poverty, you manage to adapt. You find resourceful ways to entertain yourself. I spent much of my time playing out in the woods, looking for insects under rocks, throwing rocks into the creek, even using my father's wood-carving tools to make all kinds of wooden ornaments and toys. I made things like wooden fishes, horses, dogs, even bowls for my mother. You know, that sort of thing. I did have a friend called Louis McGruman that would sometimes play with me, but a lot of the time I was left to my own devices, so I had to be resourceful, industrious if you like. My mother liked me playing outdoors. She loathed me getting under her feet, as our cabin wasn't exactly very big. The one thing I did realise was how lucky I was to live in this part of the world. I assure you, once you live in a place like Tennessee, it gets under your skin, as the place never ever leaves you. It stays with you. It is the birthplace of country music, convivial church communities, whiskey, hot spicy chicken, barbecue, and so much more. It's the golden sunsets, fertile valleys, tree-covered ridges, streams, gorges, rolling hills, exquisite mountains, transfixing beautiful views, and very crisp, fresh mountain air that can steal your breath away. At the time, my father was working for a local cattle rancher, helping him manage his illustrious cattle herd. He hired 2 farm hands to help him on his ranch. One of them was my father. One day 3 of his cows went missing, vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. The other farm hand that worked with my father told the cattle rancher that my dad had secretly confessed to him that he had stolen the cattle, which of course was a bald-faced lie. This provocative, inflammatory revelation meant that my father got the sack. The tragedy was he really needed that job, so he was so devastated. When he returned home, he was a crumbling heap of melancholia. I can still rewind that moment in time as if it was yesterday. You see, there are some things that leave an indelible mark or impression in your life, things you're meant to remember, as maybe within the intrinsic core of the memory lies an ineffaceable, deep-rooted, authentic lesson that needs to be learnt. On this unfading, impressionable occasion, my mother and I were seated at the kitchen table, having eaten some cheesy mashed potatoes and baked beans, although I noticed she was fidgeting with her food, barely eating a thing. The overwrought expression upon her face was anguished, doleful, desolate. My 2 little sisters were tucked up in bed, obliviously unaware of my mother's rising level of anxiety. We had 4 single beds all parked right next to each other, in the furthest corner of the cabin, which was really one large room, a bedroom, a kitchen, a living room, all rolled into one. Open-plan living at its most contained, you could say. So forget privacy, for we had none of that. It was about as simplistic, facile and rudimentary as it gets, but my mother, bless her cotton socks, made the inside of that cabin pretty and quirky. She was always on the lookout for little bargains to transform our cabin into a cosy nest. Believe me, that woman was a natural interior designer. She could make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And even with her minimalistic wardrobe, every Sunday when she turned up for church, she looked like she'd stepped out of a bandbox. She was so well turned out. I remember my mother apprehensively kept looking at the clock. She was continuously sighing. "Oh, where is he? Where is he? Why is he so late?" She was working herself into a frenzy, tapping her fingers on the table. It was dark outside. My father wasn't back. This was most unlike him. I watched my mother pacing up and down the cabin floor like a wild cat in a zoo enclosure. She looked heartily relieved when finally my father walked through the cabin door. Her furrowed brow visibly relaxed, her tight, stiff posture loosened, her frenzied demeanour became calm. Suffice to say, the man that returned home to us that evening was not the same man who had left for his job earlier in the morning, with a joyful skip to his gait. This was not the father I was well acquainted with, the man who would come and thump me on the back, patting my mane of blonde curls, saying,
"How you doing, son? How's your day been? Did you have lots of fun?"
Instead, his comportment was so downcast, his head was focusing on the floor, avoiding any form of eye contact with us, while his body literally sagged like a drooping flower in the meadow. He looked wilted, dishevelled, ashamed, embarrassed. My mother rushed towards him, enveloping his fragmented, flagging body in her arms.
"Thank God you're all right, Archibald Blanchett. I thought something quite dreadful had happened to you. I was worried out of my skin. You're so late this evening. You should have been back ages and ages ago. What on earth happened to you?"
"I lost my job," he said, looking at her, through the saddest eyes I've ever seen.
"Farmer Bryce has given me the sack."
For a moment she could have cut the silence with a knife, as my mother tried to assimilate what my father had told us. This was a monumental deal, as without his job, things were going to get exceedingly tough for all of us. We were barely making ends meet in the first place, so relying on my father's wage was the only thing keeping our heads above water. This horrifying revelation could quite literally sink us, driving us into the depths of even greater financial impoverishment.
"But I don't understand. Why would he do that? Why would he blatantly lie to Farmer Bryce like that? Why would he do that? What is wrong with him? It's so duplicitous. It's so wrong. It's just disgusting." "He did that, sweetheart, to cover his tracks. I think it's because he is the one that stole the cows, possibly sold them off. Who knows, but he didn't want to lose his job under any circumstances. So he cast the blame at my door. Simple, really. It's rather like the little eaglets throwing the weaker fledgling out of the nest so that they can gain more for themselves at feeding time from the parents." "But didn't you tell Farmer Bryce that you would do no such thing? That you're against stealing of any kind? That this is not the sort of thing that you would ever do? That this is completely out of character? Didn't you try to fight? Didn't you explain?" "Of course I tried to reason with him. He wasn't prepared to listen. It was like talking to a brick wall. He'd made up his mind categorically that I was responsible for the theft. It would seem he can't prove anything without any real evidence, apart from the persuasive words of a farmhand like Kurt, who can be very persuasive if he wants to be. So he decided to sack me." "That's outrageous. He can't do that." "Oh, he can, and he has done it," said my father. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, holding my mother in his arms. "I'm sorry to have let you down. I will try my damnedest to look for work in town, but it's not going to be easy." "Well, I'm not going to put up with this," said my mother, stamping her foot belligerently. "This is not acceptable. No way is this acceptable. How can Farmer Bryce do this? How can he sack you with no real evidence? Why would that iniquitous, nasty farmhand lie through his teeth like that?"
You know what the worst and the most unfair part of all this is? Is any speculative rumours getting out there of your purported thieving of Mr. Bryce's cows. If that gets out, who in their right mind is ever going to hire you for any kind of job? You know what folk are like around here. News travels faster than a wildfire, while rumours get out of control, like an infestation of lice.
"Let's not go there, sweetheart. There really is no point in crying over spilt milk. What's done is done. We have to move on with our lives. Try to be positive."
True to her word, my mother dressed to her nines in her Sunday best the following day, wearing a pretty summer frock and a smart little hat over her blonde, buoyant curls. She looked very fetching. She went to see Farmer Bryce, trying her level best to reassure him that her husband was not responsible for stealing his cows. He refused to listen to any reason.
"I'm sorry," he said to her, "but I hardly think my farmhand would lie to me about such a very serious thing. That would be atrociously wicked for him to do. I'm sorry, but the jury's out. Your husband clearly told him he stole my cows."
"Even if that were true, and supposing it was," my mother protested indignantly, "don't you see that it makes no sense, Farmer Bryce? Why would a thief confess to his crime? That would be literally begging someone to put a noose over their head.
Has it not occurred to you, Farmer Bryce, that your farmhand might be lying to you to cover his own insidious agenda? Maybe he's the one that stole the cows." "Why would Kurt do such a thing, miss?" "The name is Chloe," my mother said, tightening her lip. "You know what, Farmer Bryce? You're a very foolish man. The wool is being pulled over your eyes, and you cannot see it for yourself. Your farmhand is a duplicitous man. You need to watch him carefully, Father Bryce, because I assure you he will do it again. Don't say I didn't warn you." And with that my mother marched off defiantly. In the days that followed, my father was unable to get any work. It was clear that word had spread like wildfire around town that my father was a thief. So people whispered behind our backs in church, gave us furtive, disapproving glances. Even a couple of kids at church pointed an accusatory finger at me, telling me that their daddy said my father was not a good man. The trouble is that mud sticks. It can be very difficult to wash off. Before long, my father just slipped into a huge depression that spiraled out of control. In a trice, he began to get drunk on moonshine. We wouldn't see him all day. At night, he would come back home, and he would be wobbling and staggering all over the place like an inebriated drunk. He had never drunk like this before. My mother would just leave him to sleep off his drunken stupor on the sofa. She'd put a blanket over his body. One night he became a vile, intoxicated drunk. I'd never seen him like this before. He began to belittle, patronize, ridicule my mother with a kaleidoscope of unkind, cruel, heartless words. My father was a gentleman throughout his life, an honourable man who took a dim view of anyone who would ever dare raise a finger to a woman. But the very thing that he found so abhorrent, so reprehensible, he began doing to his own mother. As the catastrophic train smash of his life, the helpless despair, the sheer desperation of his plight, the inadequacy he felt not being able to provide for his family, had mushroomed out of control, diminishing his self-esteem, while the toxic effects of the moonshine had transformed him into a belligerent, cantankerous, mean-spirited drunk. I could see my mother's eyes, that had once been so full of adoration for my father, now filled with fear and terror. She was afraid of him. She was unable to cope with his drunken antics, became unduly worried that things were getting seriously out of hand, and of course they were. I do remember the day my father first lashed out at her. He slashed her so hard across the cheek, she nearly fell backwards onto the floor. I could hear her gasp in astonishment as she clutched her burning cheek, that was now purple in colour. He had hit her that hard. "Get out!" she screamed. "Get out of my home! How dare you hit me? How dare you? Leave now! I never want to see you again!" "I'm not leaving, woman. This is my house." "Dad, you heard her. Leave now. You're drunk. You have to leave," I told him. "And don't come back until you're sober," said my mother. My father turned his rage on me. He grabbed me violently, wrestled me, screaming all kinds of obscenities at me. "No son of mine talks to me like this. Do you understand?" I was crying as my father was punching me hard with his fists. My mother hit him on his back with a frying pan so that he turned his attention off from me onto her for a moment. She told me to run. "Run, son! Get out of here! Go!" I didn't need much encouragement. I bolted out of the cabin door, running into the woods, my floundering father swaggering, swaying and tettering behind me in a murderous, incandescent rage. As I entered the wooded area, the place where I hung around so often as a young boy, I felt afraid. I'd always been slightly skittish of the dark. It was scary being in the woods like this. Everything was so different at night, menacing, intimidating. There was a cool breeze blowing that caused the leaves to rustle. It sounded like a woman's long skirts brushing against the ground. I could hear my father running behind me, if you can call it running. I clearly had riled him up, speaking up for my mother. He wanted revenge. He was slurring his words with inaudible protests. "I'm getting you, son. I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you." He was tripping, stumbling and crashing all over the place as he cloddishly weaved himself over viridescent ferns and shrubs in his determined pursuit of me. He was yelling, "I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you." My heart was pounding in my chest violently. My breathing was sharp and fierce.
I was looking for somewhere to hide. Tears were pouring down my face, as my shirt was now soaked. I had not even realised that I was crying. It was dark in the woods, but thankfully the canopy allowed a gentle light of the moonlight to filter through the forest, so I wasn't completely stumbling around in the dark. I could hear my father looming ever closer. I didn't know what he was capable of in this drunken state. I couldn't trust him, so I was absolutely frozen with terror. Suddenly I saw something tapping me on the back. It gave me the fright of my life. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but what was it? It was a dark, shadowy, obscure figure, dense in the twilight, tall, big, human-looking. She was indicating for me to follow her. I did. Isn't it ironic, but I felt much safer around this anomalous beast than my own father. She took me towards this rocky outcrop, pulling back this massive rock as though opening a door. The rock would be physically impossible for a normal man to shift. I entered the opening with her. She rolled the rock back, and I discovered we were in a cave, but it was too dark to see a thing. I was to discover the following day that the cave was lined with deer pelts. There were beds made from pieces of broken timber, covered with lots and lots of grass, lined with pelts. The critter placed her hand on my back and led me to the bed. It was surprisingly comfortable. I must have fallen asleep that night, for the next morning I awoke up to find the tall creature studying me curiously. She had been watching me sleep. She seemed conspicuously fascinated by me, but there was also a protective look on her face, along with a kind of warm twinkle in her treacle-coloured eyes. Shafts of sunlight permeated the outer edges of the rock, filtering into the cave, so that I could see her very clearly. I was surprised by her appearance. She looked human, but she wasn't entirely human. How could she be? She was covered in hair. I noticed her hair was a dark brown colour. She smelt of the dust of the earth. I know now, without a doubt, that this lofty, majestic creature was a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. But back then, I had no clue as to what she could possibly be. I would say she was 7 foot tall, 500 pounds, muscular, burly, powerful, strong, with overlong arms that dangled beyond her knees, a distinctive cone-shaped head, depicting a face so human, a feminine face that had soft angles to it, high cheekbones, a flat nose, deep-set dark eyes that sparkled and glittered with humour. Of course, I knew she was female. She had small breasts, but also possessed such a nurturing, maternal, patriarchal energy. When I awoke, she spoke to me in a strange, audible language that contained lots of clicks. I didn't know what she was saying, but I didn't care. I knew her words were solacing, solicitous, bolstering, comforting. I knew she cared about me. She handed me an apple, so I showed her my favourite trick, where I eat the apple without using my hands, just with my mouth. She copied me, but she could do it so much better than I did. She thought it was fun to eat an apple in such an idiosyncratic way. The creature rolled back the stone from inside the cave, pushing it away from the entrance, guiding me out, replacing the rock back from where it was. It was so seamless that when I observed the rugged outcrop, you could not see that there was an opening in there that led to a cave. You would never have known that in 1,000,000 trillion years. The creature guided me through the woods, standing in the tree line, watching me return home, and when she felt assured that I was safe, she glided away. My mother was absolutely thrilled to see me. She asked me where I'd been. I remember grinning at her cheekily and saying, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And I meant every word of it, of course. How would anyone believe such a preposterous, outlandish story? In their shoes, I certainly wouldn't. A day or so later, my father returned home, looking more than a little sheepish, apologising profusely for having treated my mother so badly, and for having chased me in the woods. He did admit he didn't know what he would have done to me. He begged for her to take him back. Of course, my mother's heart melted like butter, as she loved the bones of my dad. Shortly after my encounter in the woods with the strange, hairy humanoid, my family would receive little gifts on our doorstep, like a couple of dead rabbits, a turkey, rainbow trout, a leg of a deer. It was enough to feed a family of 5 and more. So despite our limitations financially, our standard of living rocketed, as we were living off the fat of the land. We began to eat well, based on the strange delivery of gifts at our doorstep, which meant we were eating fish and game very regularly. My mother described it as manna from heaven. She thought an angel was delivering these gifts to us. She was a religious woman. She said we were going through hard times like the Egyptians in the desert before they reached the promised land. You could see she would say, God knows that my husband didn't steal those cows. We are being compensated from the injustice. I never told her that our mysterious angel was in fact a hairy humanoid, as that might have catastrophically destroyed her romantic images of a celestial golden angel with ethereal wings. On reflection, the creature I encountered must have somehow perceived our strained financial hardship. But how she perceived that, I can't fathom. But for some reason she was desirous to offer us her help. Without her generous deliveries, I dread to think how bad things would have become for us. She delivered us from a very challenging time in our lives. Despite my father thankfully abandoning the moonshine to appease my mother, you could see the weight of the world hung upon his shoulders. He was a shadow of the man that he once was, the man that I had known as my loving father. He told me that not being able to provide for your family is the most degrading, ignominious, inglorious and mortifying thing to experience. It had made him feel abjectly worthless. We could see he had sunk into a contemptuous deep depression, as the man with a jovial, fun-loving sense of humour had been vanquished from our home, and instead our cabin was filled with an oppressive gloominess that affected the morale of our home. And even my two little sisters, who were always happily playing around in the house with the one-eyed doll they shared together, weren't always comfortable in my father's presence. They would eye him warily, knowing and wondering whether they could trust him. Sometimes he would just sit on the upholstered chair in the cabin, staring out into space. He looked vacant, unengaged, absent, inexpressive, so very lost. My mother went to visit the local pastor to tell him what was going on in our home. She told him my dad couldn't get work. Everyone thought he was a thief. And this had reduced my father into a contemptible, lifeless puddle of water. I gather my mother sobbed and sobbed, while the pastor comforted her assuringly, telling her that everything would be all right. The very next night my father slipped out of our cabin, without anybody even noticing. Shortly afterwards I heard my mother scream, "Ah!" I scrambled out of bed, knowing instinctively that something was terribly wrong. My mother was crying. She was pointing at a note that was perched on the upholstered chair. It read, "I'm sorry, Chloe. I just can't go on. I hope you'll always know how much I loved you and the kids." My mother and I grabbed a kerosene lantern. We dashed out into the night, terrified of what we would find. Luckily, my two sisters remained fast asleep in bed. We had to leave them there. We hadn't any choice. Finding my father was a prerequisite. We were certain we would be too late, that we would find him, his lifeless body hanging from a tree in the wood grove, swinging against the breeze like a dress hanging on a clothesline. It was such a dreadful thought. As I ran in the woods, I felt so very numb, as if all physical feeling had been expunged from me. I had a lump in my throat, complemented by a sickly nausea that rose up in the back of my mouth. Truly, I wanted to hurl up the contents of my stomach. I felt violently ill. My mother was as white as a sheet, her eyes wide with terror. She was muttering under her breath, "Please, God, no. Please, God, no. No, God, please. I beg you, God, please, no." I just remember the stillness of that velvety black night. Everything was haunting, so deathly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop as the natural choruses of the night from the insects and the frogs had been extinguished like the flames from a candle wick. There were no howls from a coyote or wolf, no hoot from an owl. It was ominously still. The only thing I could really hear was the thundering of my own heart, and of course the discernible crushing sound of our boots crackling the twigs and forest debris beneath our cushioned soles. Everything was blanketed in a heaviness that was tangible. The woods were teeming with towering oaks, maples, dogwoods and yellow polars, and they all jiggled ominously against the cool breeze, their boughs swaying backwards and forwards against the moonlit shadows, making you falsely believe that you were seeing shadow people creeping around you. But I didn't care about any of this. All I wanted was my father back home, safe and well with us. That was the only thing in the world that mattered. The question was it too late? Were we too late? All of a sudden we heard a crashing, crunching sound, as if a tree branch had snapped under a heavy weight. To date, it was the most terrifying sound that I've ever heard. Me and my mother hurriedly dashed towards the sound, terrified about what we would see. We saw a couple of raccoons climbing down a snap bough, who hurriedly scurried away when they saw us.
The relief we felt was immeasurable. My mother took her hand in mine, squeezing it tightly. "It's going to be fine. I promise you, it's going to be fine. We'll find him." After searching the wood grove and finding absolutely nothing, I suddenly remembered the hairy woman in the woods. I wondered if she might have seen anything. "Where are we going?" my mother asked me, perturbed that I was leading her towards a rocky outcrop. Of course, I had no recollection where the cave was, as the rocks all looked uniform and undisturbed, but I knew somewhere in this vast mountainous outcrop was a cave where the hairy lady lived. I started to call out my father's name. Then something extraordinary happened. The rock rolled back, and who should be standing there but the hairy humanoid with my father? She was directing my father out of the cave. My mother was absolutely astonished. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It looked like she was going to faint from the shock. In her hand, the hairy lady carried a rope with a noose around it. She pointed to my father, his neck and the noose, looking directly at my mother. My mother said, "I know. He tried to kill himself. Thank you. Thank you for saving him." She ran towards the hairy lady, throwing her arms around her in gratitude. I think the hairy lady was surprised, but she seemed pleased by the kind gesture. She showed my mother that she was keeping the rope. She wasn't giving it to my father. I remember my mother started hitting my dad. "How could you do that to us? How could you do that to us? Why would you do something so silly?" Then she threw her arms around him and burst into tears. "I love you so much, sweetheart. Don't you dare do that to me again. Don't you dare do that to us again. Never ever think that just because you don't have a job that you're not worth anything. You're priceless in my sight." It was on Sunday when we went to church that the pastor began to preach about judgment. "I'd like to quote from Matthew 7, he said. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. Why do you look at the sawdust in your brother's eye, and not pay attention to the plank in your own?" If you think I'm quoting scripture, he continued, I am. But I'm also looking at my congregation, that I'm ashamed to say is full of hypocritical, self-righteous Pharisees, whom all have planks in their eyes, who have been very quick to judge a member of our flock with a cruel, callous heartlessness that makes me ashamed to call myself your pastor. I would have thought better of my own flock, a lot better of all of you. But each and every one of you has disappointed me bitterly. I can only imagine how you have offended, dismayed your heavenly Father in heaven, whom you so proclaim to love. Archibald Blanket, said the pastor, can you please come up here? My father staggered awkwardly to his feet, where he faced the entire congregation, while the pastor put a protective arm on his sleeve. Look at this man here. What do you people all do? When he was sacked from his job, accused of stealing 3 cows from Farmer Bryce, what did you all do? You all went around with fire starters, your poisonous tongues spreading rumours about this man, tearing his reputation to shreds like an old piece of clothing, ensuring that no one would ever offer him a job again. You contaminated and destroyed his reputation. Not only did you destroy his sense of self-esteem, his dignity, his self-respect, but you robbed his family of joy. You were the greatest thieves of all, merciless, repugnant, hideously vile, reprehensible, for you stole from this man his very soul. You robbed from him the joy of his family. You expunged all hope from him, so that he had nothing left to live for. You did that to him. Every one of you here is guilty as charged, without exception. Did one of you offer him a job like the Good Samaritan, who saw the downtrodden stranger on the side of the road in a very bad way, and lifted him out of the pit to help him? Oh, no, that would be too much to ask. For no, my congregation is high and mighty, too high and mighty for all that. The congregation was deadly quiet for a moment. No one said a word. Then one man courageously waved his arm. Pastor, I must apologise. I feel very ashamed. Everyone in this town has been speaking badly of Archibald. We let this happen among us. You're right, Pastor. We should be ashamed of ourselves. Very ashamed. Archibald, he said, addressing my father personally, please will you forgive the townsfolk for the way that we have treated you? My father nodded. Of course, he said. Of course I forgive. For the record, I'd like to stand before God and this entire congregation, swearing to you all that I never stole Farmer Bryce's cows. The man who'd expressed his apologies to my dad said, We all know, regardless of your innocence, Archibald, that we are the ones that have committed the greater crime here, far more insidious than the theft of 3 cows, for we have ruined a man's honour. He lifted his wife's hat off her head, which made her look up in surprise. I think we owe Archibald a very big apology. Anyone like to express their regret with their pockets? Anyone got a good job they can offer Archibald? In the days that followed, our family was treated like celebrities in town. The baker, butcher and grocer gave my family free produce. People sent my sisters brand new toys. The family was given clothes and shoes. Job offers began shooting through the sky like rockets. Better still, Farmer Bryce came to apologise personally to my father, exclaiming that he had to sack Kurt the farmhand, as he was the one that was pilfering the cows. I gather he'd stolen 3 more. Farmer Bryce gave my father 3 cows to compensate for having falsely accused him of taking them in the first place, but the pastor told him to triple it, and so my father ended up acquiring 9 cows and offered him an excellent job as farm manager of Mr. Bryce's farm. Our standard of living escalated so that even the hairy humanoid stopped delivering us gifts. She could sense our lives were a lot better now. Over the years we saw her watching over us as if she considered us her responsibility. She was always taking care of us. I will never forget her. She was such a beautiful soul. I do hear ugly stories told about Bigfoot, but I don't always listen to them. My mother exclaimed that the hairy lady in the woods was very definitely an angel from God, because she had transformed our lives in every way. Without her presence, things would have been very different for all of us. Whoa, I said to Gramps. That's one hell of a story. Did it really happen? Of course it happened, said my Gramps. Well, I'm sorry, Gramps, but your story trumps the Stephen King novel you're reading. It's bloody amazing. I've never heard a story like that. Now you can see why I enjoy having my Gramps around. Over the last couple of years, he has taught me so much. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.